Well, this is really different.
Live nerd show, Pearl Street Studios.
So here we are, Energy Nerd Show. Welcome. And welcome, Jack Smith.
Hey, Jack.
Thank you. Good to be here. Part of the nerd herd.
What's the nerd herd talking about today?
Oh, climate change.
Always an uplifting topic.
Climate change. What's going on with climate change, Jack?
Earlier this week, I got to share my favorite graph with Synapse Energy Economics, just across the street on Mass Ave. Wonderful company. Happy to be a part of it. And what I chose for my favorite graph is equilibrium climate sensitivity.
Naturally.
Naturally. Nice, uplifting, fun, simple topic, which happens to be one of the really kind of foundational uncertainties in climate science. Equilibrium climate sensitivity is the amount of temperature rise you get on the Earth after doubling CO2 from pre-industrial levels, after the Earth has equilibrated. So after all systems play out, ocean heating evens out, all different feedback loops completely play out, and the Earth arrives at rest after many, many hundreds or thousands of years. That number, that amount of temperature rise you get is still an unknown. And it has been really ever since 1979 or so, was sort of the first decent estimate of a range of values for how much the Earth will warm. And that same range persists really to today, despite tons of studies that have looked at this. And so this remains a big uncertainty, and yet I think it's one of these beautiful examples that shows us why uncertainty should motivate more climate action rather than less.
Definitely. So what does your favorite graph include?
Well, I've stolen it from my favorite climate change book, shamelessly, which is Climate Shock by Gernot Wagner. Have to give him a shout out. But I don't know what page it's on, but there's this beautiful graph that shows a curve, and it's a sort of changed up bell curve shaped graph. And on the y-axis, you have probability density, and on the x-axis, you have temperature. And this bell-shaped curve shows you the range of probabilities that equilibrium climate sensitivity is going to fall between any two values. So you can look at this graph and you see this sort of hump in the middle, and you can look at the x-axis and tell that most of the probability of temperature rise is between, say, 1 and like 5 degrees Celsius. But there's this special feature of this graph, which is a fat tail off to the right side. So you can picture your bell curve. It doesn't just look like a symmetrical bell. On the right side, it sort of tails off far into the far right distance. And it turns out that there's a lot of probability under that fat tail. There's maybe something like 10%. And that tells us that there is a pretty decent chance that you get way more warming than, say, 4.5 degrees Celsius if you double CO2 levels from the pre-industrial level. So, jargon aside, what this should tell us is, yes, there's uncertainty over how much warming you get from doubling CO2, but the uncertainty is on the side of it's more likely to get warmer than cooler, which is bad news for us.
So what are the temperatures at sort of close to the end of that fat tail?
Well, it sort of tapers off into infinity. I'm not actually sure if there is an asymptote there, if it really tapers off, but from like 6 degrees to 10 degrees, you're looking at something like 10% of the probability is underneath that portion of the curve.
Wow, that's too many.
Right.
too high a percent for comfort.
Yeah, and you can imagine the last ice age was only something like 6 degrees Celsius cooler than it is today. So if we're looking at 4, 5, 6 plus degrees hotter, that's a gigantic change from business as usual. And if there's something like a 10% chance of that, or even if it's only 5%, we pay insurance to cover catastrophic risks with probabilities that are orders of magnitude lower than that. Right. So it kind of begs this question, how much should we be willing to pay, or should we act now to avoid a decent chance of catastrophic risk?
So like spending a couple percent of the gross national product in order to avoid some of these worst case outcomes might seem like a bargain.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it depends on how much a person cares about uncertainty. I think it matters a lot in this context. Climate scientists have been striving to contain the uncertainty in this particular area for a long time. And I think that my perception is we've gotten more and more and more sure that the range of possible values is correct, but the range has not shrunk much since like 1980.
If we had a lot of planets, then we could do some controlled experiments. Well, and a lot of time. If we had centuries and many Earths, then
right.
we could really figure out this probability distribution.
Yeah, I mean, we're running the experiment now. We'll find out. The uncertainty will resolve, but let's hope for the best.
Maybe to look on the bright side, what's happening on that cooler end of the bell curve?
Well, on the cooler end, this is the end of the graph that has had the most resolution of uncertainty, in my view, from what I know. And that means that, scientists have become more and more and more sure that there's less probability under the really far left side of that curve. So we're very likely going to get at least 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming from doubling pre-industrial CO2. And maybe as an aside of how close we are to that doubling, pre-industrial times CO2 concentrations were like 280 parts per million. You double that, you get to like 560. My favorite graph happens to be a graph of what happens at 700 ppm, so a little bit higher, but the shape is the same. So for all intents and purposes, we can still use it. But at the low end, it would be great if we were all surprised and if the climate changed a lot less than we would think. But odds are we'll get more than we want.
Yeah, this is one of the most studied aspects of science and economics in human history.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like this and the social cost of carbon are two of the holy grails of the pursuit of environmental economics and climate science in general. And another one of my graphs is courtesy of Carbon Brief, who's written a beautiful article on climate sensitivity, shows kind of the range from the early 2000s of just how many studies have looked at this particular problem of equilibrium climate sensitivity. And it's kind of stunning to just see how many studies there are and how different their ranges of values are through time. There's sort of a flurry of studies from 2012 to say 2018. And despite all of this work, the estimated range from 1.5 degrees to 4.5 degrees really hasn't changed all that much.
So what do you say to the folks who latch on to that uncertainty as a reason to do more studies and not take action?
Defer any sort of meaningful action.
I mean, as far as doing more studies goes, that's not in conflict with taking climate action at all. I think we should be studying this. I'm glad that there have been so many studies and that there is just this flurry of activity in this area. It's a really interesting area that's important to understanding kind of basic interactions of humanity with climate. But if a person's concerned about uncertainty, you should look at the direction that the uncertainty is going. Is the uncertainty on the side of we're going to have less warming and we're all going to be okay? Or is the uncertainty on the side of things could actually be much worse than we think? And I think that's the direction that this uncertainty points.
As shown by the fat tail.
Yeah, as shown by the fat tail. And even though it takes many, many, many hundreds of years to get to that equilibrium point, it's worth heading off that disaster long before it happens. And we have the ability to do that today. Let's look at some more graphs.
Let's see some more graphs.
So graph number 3, let's talk about maybe how some of the different estimates of equilibrium climate sensitivity differ. And one of the main ways that they differ is in the technique that you arrive at this range of values. So you have models which are driven just by sort of foundational physics, where equilibrium climate sensitivity is a factor that sort of arises out of your model. It's not something you program in, but you can observe it after the model is run. So that's one way to do it. Another is to look at paleoclimate data, and try to see what's happened in the past with changes in CO2. Another is to look at instrumental data that we have in the modern day. That's very rich, and you can get some estimates from that. And these all sort of differ. There are different combinations of these approaches. Instrumental data, for example, tends to give you the climate tends to look less sensitive to CO2. So your range is, from 1 to a little less than 4 maybe degrees, whereas paleoclimate data might have a higher sensitivity on the high end. So there are this is what drives some of the debate. But you sort of average across these, and Carbon Brief does a beautiful job of this visually and in their writing of just showing all studies together haven't constrained this foundational uncertainty very much.
Well, I'm glad there are so many studies. I feel like that's a lot of evidence.
And you mentioned the social cost of carbon. I think a lot of the estimates of the social cost of carbon are based on kind of expected or temperature changes that are at the middle of this curve, right? It's middle of this distribution for a doubling of atmospheric CO2. And so in some ways, it could be much, much worse in terms of the economic damages.
Yeah, and even thinking about, say the Paris Agreement targets, if we want to limit warming to 2 degrees or aspirationally 1.5, you have to, one would want to know how much more can we emit before we hit that point. And that is one of these uncertainties that is really a kind of a concern.
Where are we today?
I believe we're a little over 1 degree Celsius. So that already kind of cuts off the front little tiny smidge of this concerning curve where we know we're at least there, and we haven't doubled pre-industrial CO2 yet. I think we're at like 420 parts per million, somewhere like that, and we raise the concentration by 4 to 5 ppm per year in general. So if we continue, if we just held emissions flat, you would have something like 30-ish years until you doubled pre-industrial CO2. And you still wouldn't answer this question of what is climate sensitivity, because it takes time for those Earth system feedbacks to all play out. But you do have something called the transient climate response, which is just sort of the in the moment where CO2 emissions hit that doubling point, what's happening. And that is a little bit more constrained. It's more like 1 to 2.5, maybe 3 degrees. But even that is significant, and we're already feeling impacts today from 1 degree. So why let it get there?
Yeah, we can't go any farther. Well, we try to keep this show short. I think that we have to have Jack back for another episode.
It would be my pleasure.
I mean, this is sort of dismal to think of how bad off we are, but I always like to bring in a little message of hope. And to me, the fact that all of this work, so many people are doing such great work to really like crack the nut of what's predicted, what's certain, what's uncertain. There's no question we should be doing more. And it's great that so many people are working on it, I think. So thanks.
Yeah, and thanks for being on the show.
Thanks. Happy to be here.